Hello, Simone! Today is going to be a very interesting episode on a topic I should have done a long time ago. It's going to be on how the movement that today purports itself to be witchcraft or Wiccan or Druidic, all of these religious systems are very, very modern. They are some of the youngest religious systems to exist and have literally no ties to any historic pagan faith practices. And even when they were revised as monotheistic traditions and only became pagan in their later iterations.
What?
Specifically here, I'm talking about the guy who made up the Druidic faith, not the Wiccan faith. These were both around the 1900s. So we're going to go into these individuals, how they made it up, how they got people to believe them. We're going to go into Aleister Crowley, another interesting figure. He didn't even claim to have connections to anything in the past. He was just a wackadoo. I didn't know he was a real guy. I saw him from like a show, right? And I was like, oh, a real guy. No, he was a wacko, but way more fun than the other guys because at least he owned that he was just making everything up. And the other guys, well, and he stole a bunch from Kabbalah, and we'll go over where.
So were the other guys trying
practiced as witchcraft today within the Wiccan community, not realizing that what they're practicing doesn't come from ancient witches, but it comes from Jewish mysticism.
My God. Do I understand correctly then that the two men who claimed to have either rediscovered or who reignited Druidic practices in Wicca sort of pointed to historical materials that they may have either misinterpreted or made up, kind of like Joseph Smith using funerary texts from Egypt?
No, it's well, maybe not crazier than the Joseph Smith story, but he said he met a cult in the woods that taught him about all of this. It's the first one we're going to go to.
Met a cult
so the first
in the woods,
one, and we think we know who some of the figures he was talking about were, so we know that like they didn't do this because there's been people who have gone through and researched him to learn more about this. So the guy was Gerald Gardner, a retired British civil servant with a taste for the occult. He returned to England in the 1930s, and he claimed that in 1939, he was initiated into a secret coven in New Forest by a group he called the Wicca, allegedly survivors of an ancient pagan witch cult.
Ooh.
His story leaned heavily on the now debunked theories of anthropologist Margaret Murray, who argued in the 1920s that European witchcraft was a remnant of pre-Christian fertility religions. Scholars later dismantled Murray's hypothesis. There is no solid evidence of a contiguous witch cult surviving the Middle Ages, but Gardner ran with it. So a quick note here, if you're like, well, where did all of these mystical traditions come from if they didn't come from some ancient religion? It turns out that people will invent the same mystical traditions over and over again. For example, when you hear a sports player keeps a lucky sock under their helmet or something to win games, you don't go, oh, he must have picked that up from some ancestral religion. You're like, oh, yes, humans often end up associating fetishes, not like sexual fetishes, but like small token stuff with having magical properties and then build rituals around them. It is a natural and emergent human behavior. With the fact that we see today things like chaos magic, which is another group I could go into, where they believe things like McDonald's arches are like abundant signs and stuff like that and can be used like just, or you see pop culture paganism where people will believe that like Loki, not Loki like the ancient Norse god, but Loki like the hot guy from Marvel.
Oh my God. Oh no.
The one who all the girls get a crush on. I mean, I don't know, but I hear that he's supposed to be the hot
not
one.
The actual god.
No. The different like Marvel
like
characters.
Loki or Snape wives, right? Like, yeah, but not the
Snape
not the
wives.
fictional,
Snape is definitely no connection
like
to
Harry
anything.
Potter Severus, like the actor. Whatever his face is.
So it's not that there was no rituals being practiced in these regions, but these rituals were almost certainly maybe 2 generations old. They were not, it's very hard to keep rituals running a long time unless they are being practiced publicly and at the community level. When rituals aren't being practiced at the community level or really rigidly within a family structure, like, and we've seen this historically over and over again, it's hard to keep a tradition going without public rituals or at least publicly saying that you're a member of it. But we'll get to like other proof we have that he probably wasn't even pulling this from local folklore of the period.
Oh God, not even trying. But you know what? I like the idea of being a lifelong fan of cults and just making the cult you wish existed, right? Can you imagine a lifetime spent in civil service, your nights and weekends spent, looking to find proof of the thing you wish existed, and you're like, you know what, screw it, just gonna make it up.
I'm just gonna no, but
because then people followed. People like actually started doing like
all
he
these
made it
other people
happen.
made up their religions, like Alex
man,
Crowley
like
and
it
stuff
starts
like that.
somewhere. They say, dress for the job you want to get, be the person you want to be. Like he did it. He made the cult he wanted. I'm so happy for him. That's nice.
So in the 1930s, he got involved, or he says he got involved with the local esoteric scene in Hampshire. He claimed that in September 1939, he was introduced to a hidden group of witches in the New Forest, led by a woman who he called Old Dorsey, later identified as Dorsey Clutterbuck.
The very real name of Dorsey Clutterbuck,
right? Yes. Now, this is a real person who later people went and investigated the area he was and who he was talking to. And Dorsey Clutterbuck did exist, and he referred to her as like a wealthy older woman who fit Dorsey Clutterbuck at the time. She was a wealthy conservative Christian woman who lived in Highcliffe near New Forest and died in 1951.
Oh, so she would have found this very offensive.
Oh, yeah. Gardner's associate, Doreen Valentine, tracked down her diaries via Clutterbuck's housekeeper after her death and confirmed her identities. The diaries mention social events and gardening, but nothing about witchcraft or covens. So the person who discovered all of this was a true believer in this guy. Okay, it was his assistant. Sure. So she had no motivation to lie or try to deceive us. She found the lady who supposedly taught all of this to this guy. This lady was a devout Anglican and a well-known devout Anglican. Not only that, but they had her private diaries. So it's not like she was practicing one thing in private and then doing another thing in public. She privately was a devout Anglican. And interestingly, what was I going to say here? She was, on the other hand, did know a lot about folklore and was very interested in folklore. So what seems likely is she may have taught him about some local folklore, and he built the rest of this character himself. Now, historian Ronald Hutton in Triumphs of the Moon, 1999, argues that Clutterbuck might have been a figurehead used by Gardner to legitimize his story. She was an unlikely witch, devoutly Anglican and socially prominent, but her eccentricity and interest in folklore could have made her a possible cover if Gardner needed one. Gardner lived in the area in the late 1930s and mingled with occult enthusiasts, including members of the Rosicrucian Order Croatan Fellowship, a mystical group with a theater in Christchurch. Some speculate this group or a splinter of it might have inspired his coven story. A member, Edith Woodruff Grimes, nicknamed Daffo, was close to Gardner and more plausibly involved in occult activities, but there's no record of her leading a pagan witch cult. So something important to note here, if somebody's like, is it entirely implausible that a group with old practices was meeting in the woods? Yes, it actually is, because there were so many and widely known other occultic traditions of this period, like this one that we're going to go into just a second, that people would have just associated with if they had those inclinations, instead of going to this secret one that met in the woods. Why not do what you do today and go with the theater kids, where they're all, I love it that it was theater kids back then, theater kids today. But then you're like,
this is all very traditional. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe this Rosicrucian Order Croatan Fellowship, maybe they had some ancient traditions. Here's the problem. We know what they believed, and we know where they said they got it from. The core beliefs of the ROCF claim to preserve secret knowledge from ancient Egypt and the Renaissance Rosicrucians. So not local. If you're wondering who the Rosicrucians were, it was a spiritual and cultural movement that arose in modern Europe in the early 17th century after the publication of several texts announcing to the world a new esoteric order. Rosicrucianism is symbolized by a rose cross or a rosy cross. It was a Christian-tied movement that was interested in things like alchemy. Anyway, a group, okay? The point being is they said where they got it was from Egyptians and Rosicrucians, Renaissance Rosicrucians. It was not from some sort of local hidden witch cult that preserved some ancestral pre-Roman tradition that was local to Britain, okay? Which is where he said this stuff came from, okay? They believed in hidden great white brotherhood of enlightened masters guiding humanity.
Oh dear.
Sullivan taught that members could tap into cosmic forces through meditation, ritual, study, think astrology, Kabbalah, and other theophysical ideas about reincarnation. Theatrical flair by the 1930s, when Gardner encountered them, ROCF had their base in Christchurch near the New Forest, where they had built Ashram Hall, a tiny theater for mystical plays. Sullivan wrote and performed these dramas, The Rite of Isis, for example, blending Egyptian mythology with Christian allegory and to enact spiritual truths. Members wore robes, chanted, and staged ceremonies, less quote-unquote witchy and more like a cosmic morality play. Practical mysticism, unlike hardcore occult groups like the Golden Dawn, the ROCF was less about spellcasting and more about self-improvement through esoteric philosophy. They attracted middle-class seekers, doctors, teachers, retirees, looking for meaning in a post-World War I world. Some rituals involved healing vibrations or channeling divine energy, but was pretty tame compared to Gardner's later Wiccan rites. So keep in mind things like trying to talk to the dead and mystics doing like stage performances to scam people was really common in this period.
Oh yeah.
We'll do another episode on Houdini's war against mystics.
Yes. Yeah. All these people like tapping on seance tables, etc. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Because it's fascinating to learn about. But yeah, so how did this grow up? Or go from here in 1954 after Britain repealed its Witchcraft Act in 1951 specifically, which prevented publishing this stuff. Gardner published Witchcraft Today, laying out his version of this ancient religion. He blended Murray's ideas with bits of ceremonial magic, St. Freemasonry and Aleister Crowley's influence, folklore, and his own imagination. His rituals, like the use of a magical circle, ashrams, ritual knives, and a dualistic god-goddess framework. He did believe in like a dualistic singular monotheistic god that had a feminine and masculine side. Very Kabbalah there, were cobbled together from Victorian occultism, not dusty grimoires from antiquity. Gardner's collaborator, Doreen Valentia, this is the one who later identified who the old lady was, joined in the 1950s and polished his work, stripping out some of Crowley's heavier Thelemic vibes to make it more palatable. Valentia herself admitted the rituals were modern, not ancient, though she believed they tapped into the timeless spiritual current. So basically, the person who inherited the Wiccan tradition and then built on it admits this guy made it all up.
I feel like even more so, like, okay,
I think this validates it more so long as you're willing to accept that.
It's just like understanding this is the culty religion for people who wish there was a culty religion and acknowledge that there just isn't one. Like, that's historical.
Yeah. And I think you're going to like this next guy, Simone.
Okay.
So you can be like, who is this Aleister Crowley? You know, I've heard this term before.
Yes.
What was he about if other people were picking up his ideas?
Okay.
So born in 1875 in Warwickshire, England, to a wealthy, strict Plymouth Brethren family, Edward Aleister Crowley rebelled hard against his religious upbringing. After his father's death, he inherited money, ditched Cambridge, where he studied but didn't graduate, and dove into the occult. By his 20s, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, 1898, a secret society blending Kabbalah, tarot, like tarot cards, and ritual magic.
Tarot.
Think Victorian England's Hogwarts for mystics.
Okay.
He clashed with its leaders like W.B. Yeats, got kicked out, but it shaped his lifelong obsession with esoteric systems. Oh, I should dig into that secret society more.
Yeah.
The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn at some point. Crowley styled himself a larger-than-life figure. He called himself the Great Beast 666, loved scandalizing polite society, and lived a chaotic life of drugs, sex, and travel. Egypt, India, Mexico, Sicily, and this is traveling in the 1800s, so this is like wild travel. In 1904, while in Cairo with his wife, Rose claimed a spirit named Ayahuasca dictated the Book of the Law to him over 3 days, a text that became foundational to his philosophy, which was called Thelema. He spent the rest of his life until his death in 1947 spreading Thelema, writing prolifically, poetry, novels, occult treatises, and founding groups like AA, well, it's A and then like a triangle and then A and then a triangle, a magical order, and the Ordo Templi Ortanis, OTO, which he retooled to fit his vision. His reputation, a mix of genius and infamy. Papers dubbed him the wickedest man in the world for his libertine lifestyle, opium, orgies, and rumors of black magic, mostly exaggerated. But he was a serious thinker, blending Eastern mysticism, Western occultism, and his own flair into something unique. Gardner met him in the 1940s through mutual occult circles, and Crowley's influence seeped into Wiccan's rituals, even if toned down later. Despite the ancient veneer, Crowley did not pretend Thelema was a literal hand-me-down from pharaohs or medieval wizards. He was upfront that the Book of the Law was a new revelation dictated to him in 1904 and called it the start of a fresh spiritual epic, not a dusty relic. So basically, he's so much an egoist. He's like, I don't need any, this is just all new, dictated to me by spirits.
Wow. I mean, that's not that much of a deviation from so many historical religious leaders who heard from spirits.
But you can also see why old traditions get washed out so quickly. If even this guy who was trying his very best to sort of pick up some form of like pure mysticism of England that had any sort of an ancient root ended up being heavily influenced by this other guy who not even a full generation before was like, I made all this up. You're like, okay, I can see how if you add in the third every generation with your next crop of crazy people, it's going to really quickly wipe out any historic stuff if you don't have text to be going off of.
I think so, yeah.
Now, I wanted to dig more into the Thelemic vibes, because remember it said that a lot of Crowley's had this Thelemic stuff.
Yeah.
And the other guy who made up Wiccanism ended up buying into the Thelemic stuff and writing it directly into the religion, which is one of how we know it's not ancient, because we know the guy who made it all up. Mm-hmm. But the person after him, Valentine, attempted to remove a lot of this Thelema stuff, because the idea of, well, this gets back to maybe what is a historic religion a bit more. Thelema's central tenet is do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, which the Satanists also picked up, meaning to follow your true will, your deepest purpose above all else. It's
or as Cartman says, I'm going to do what I want.
Yes. Self-liberation, cosmic exploration, and rejecting conventional morality. The vibe, Thelemic rituals and writings drip with theatricality and intensity. Think elaborate chants, references to Egyptian gods like Nut, Hadid, etc. A mix of sex, power, and mysticism. Crowley's stuff often feels dense and rebellious, with a break-all-the-rules attitude. For example, his Gnostic Mass involves a priestess, a priest, and symbolic acts hinting at sacred sexuality, i.e. naked priest and priestess, way more esoteric than Wiccan's circle casting and moon worship. Crowley's influence on Gardner. Gardner borrowed Thelemic phrasing and structure, like Crowley's focus on invoking higher powers, or his use of smote it be, a Masonic Thelemic sign-off that Wicca kept. So Wicca also took some ideas from Freemasons, okay, again, just stealing from everywhere, but none of it particularly ancient. Some early Wiccan rites even echoed Crowley's obsession with polarity, male, female, light, dark, though Gardner redirected it towards fertility and nature. Vic, so what do you think of this guy? Better? I mean, I do like the person who followed up immediately after Gardner. It feels like she adds a lot of validity to the Wiccan tradition by, one, admitting that it was made up, and then two, trying to remove the parts that are the very most made up, and trying to create this sort of like nature religion instead of a religion focused on like rebellion for rebellion's sake.
It sort of feels to me like a fan community trying to make itself work and to make it itself sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting.
Let's look at where these communities borrowed from Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, which was largely, by my estimation, just pop philosophy of the year like 1000. That's around when it was collated. So it's a fairly, obviously Jews are going to be very offended by this, but the ideas in Kabbalah, like you can track where they came from. They have a lot of mirrors and other things. They come from a school of Jewish mysticism that was popular around that time and had existed, or we have records of it for a few hundred years before that time. Sufi mysticism and basically pop mysticism of that time period. Mm-hmm. But it was genuinely ancient from their perspective, because it was about 1,000 years old by the, well, not 1,000, like 800, 900 years old by the time they were writing. And if you go back to its inspirations, then you're looking at like maybe 1,200 years old. And so that's genuinely historic there. But then the idea is, okay, so what from Kabbalah ended up being captured in the Wiccan tradition? If you're like, oh, what parts of Wiccanism come directly from Kabbalah? Well, one, we know Crowley, so it came through Crowley, not through Gardner, maybe directly, in that Crowley ended up including a lot of Kabbalah in his stuff. He was a huge Kabbalah nerd. He studied it in the Golden Dawn and made it the backbone of Thelema, especially his magical order, A triangle. Here's what he lifted. Tree of Life as a map. Crowley used the Tree of Life to structure spiritual progress. In his systems, initiates climb the Sulfuric like a ladder from Malkut, the physical world, to Keter, union with the divine. Each grade in the A triangle corresponds to a Seraphi with rituals and meditations to master its energies. For example, his book 777, 1909, is a Kabbalistic cheat sheet linking Sephiroth to colors, planets, and tarot. Numerology and what?
Tarot,
I don't know. Numerology and gematria. Crowley was obsessed with Kabbalistic number crunching. He analyzed the Book of Law using gematria, where Hebrew letters, which doubled as numbers, reveal hidden meanings. For instance, he equated will, Thelema in Greek, equals 93, with love, agape, equals 93. Tying it to his maximum, love is the law, love under will. This numerological play came straight from Kabbalah's playbook. So here I'll note, and this obviously causes a major problem for modern Kabbalists, is that the movement that both Wiccanism is descended from and modern Satanism is descended from borrowed a bunch of stuff from their writings, which of course means that a lot of the symbols and symbolism, when you look at like Kabbalistic symbolism, you'll be like, oh, that looks like satanic or Wiccan symbolism. And the reason is not that they emerged from the same tradition, but that these other two traditions just directly copied Kabbalism when they were started. And a lot of them forget that that's what they were doing.
That's really funny. I can see why, though. I mean, there's so much to play with there.
Yeah. No, if you're going to build a mystical tradition, Kabbalism's a great place to start. And it's got some claims to antiquity. It's of the mystic traditions, one of the older that we and I think modern-ish. What you'll notice about Kabbalism is that it feels much more like these modern systems of mysticism than the ancient systems of mysticism, which come either here or you're looking at like a Greek, more general polytheism, which has a very different feel to it, or you were looking at the really interesting one. What were they called? The algebra nerds. I've got to remember what they're called, but it was a Greek philosophical tradition based around mathematics. The group I was thinking of here were the Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans followed strict rules and rituals aimed at achieving purity and spiritual enlightenment. They believed in reincarnation and sought to escape the cycle of rebirth by living an austere life and adhering to their philosophical and mathematical principles.
I don't know, some math.
And they practiced a really interesting philosophy that may have some relations to the branches of like early Christianity and Judaism. And it was very interesting philosophy, but it feels very different from the older traditions, I guess is what I'd say. And in that respect, Kabbalism did invent a genuinely new way or coalesce what was becoming popular in the Middle Ages, a new way of relating to the mystical. Thelemic rites, like the lesser banishing rite of the pentagram inherited from the Golden Dawn, uses Kabbalistic names for God, YHVH, Adoni, and archangels, Michael and Gabriel, tied to the Sephiroth. Crowley's Gnostic Mass invokes divine polarity, think Binah and Chokmah, the feminine and masculine Sephiroth, to mirror Kabbalah's balance of opposites. Symbolism, Crowley tied Thelemic deities to the tree newt as infinite, Ein Sof, Hadith as the point of consciousness, Keter or Chokman, and then I don't need to go into all that. The Rakaman as action, Gever or Tifan. He didn't just copy, he rebranded Kabbalah's abstract energies into his Egyptian pantheon, but the framework's Kabbalistic roots are clear.
Gosh. So it's almost like he did a Control F and then replaced a bunch of like words.
Yeah, he basically Control F Kabbalistic practices.
Oh boy, that's great.
If I'm going to be self-reflective here, I think that this is where a large part of my negative bias against Kabbalism comes from, is that the first time I would have engaged with this category of mysticism or a branch of mysticism partially descended from this tree would have been when my friends in high school and middle school were getting into like Wiccanism, and I would go through some of their books and be like, is there anything to this? Like, what's going on with this? Or other forms of, hermetics and stuff like that, I think a lot of people go through where they're like, okay, I'm going to research the edgiest of mystical paths because I'm a middle schooler and I want to see what my parents don't want me to see. And so when I reapproached it as an adult, the mental frameworks appeared very similar to ones I was engaging with ideas that were particularly sophomoric or otherwise puerile. It would be a bit like if you grew up in Japan and your first experiences with Christian theology and cosmology were from Neon Evangelion. And so when you like read the Bible, you're like, oh gosh, yeah, I remember all this stuff from my weird otaku phase when I was really into Neon Evangelion. Crowley didn't claim that Thelema was Kabbalah. He saw it as a new revelation there. But I find that really interesting, and it's kind of a shame for modern, because to some people that would be seen as invalidating of Kabbalah, but I'm like, he also borrowed Christian concepts. You're just, you're going to be more familiar when he talks about angels and Michael.
It's kind of, I mean, it really does. Again, it feels a lot like fan fiction and just mixing and remixing and then trying to make it into your own thing that people get excited about independently, which is exactly what happened here.
Yeah. So when Doreen Valentine, this is the one who took over from him afterwards, joined Gardner, and the one who discovered the old lady, joined the coven in 1953, she became his right-hand collaborator, helping refine the rituals. This is Gerald Gardner. It's the guy who invented Wiccanism's right-hand collaborator, helping refine the rituals and texts that would define Gardinian Wiccan. Gardner's early book, The Book of Shadows, the ritual playbook for Wicca, was a mashup of influences, including stuff he'd picked up from Aleister Crowley, as I mentioned there. However, Valentine found some of the material too dark, too intense, or just too Crowley specific for the broader nature-loving pagan vibe Gardner wanted to sell, so she rewrote parts and softened the edges to make Wiccan more accessible. So I asked, well, what did she
Again, so fan fiction-y. I'm just going to like remix this, make it a little more...
It is very like an early fan fiction community, yeah. Valentine specifically targeted chunks of the text Gardner had lifted from Crowley's works, the Book of Law and the Gnostic Mass. For example, Gardner's original rituals included Crowley's dramatic invocations, like calling on quote-unquote the mighty ones, with a heavy poetic flair and phrases tied to Thelemic concepts. More on that below. Valerie replaced these with simpler, more folkloric language, emphasizing the goddess and horned god over Crowley's esoteric ideas. She also toned down some of the sexual undertones and mystical bombasts that Crowley loved, which didn't fit her vision of a gentle, earthier witchcraft. One famous tweak, she rewrote the charge of the goddess from a clunky, Crowley-heavy draft to the lyrical versions Wiccans still use today. Why she did it? She wasn't anti-Crowley. She respected his intellect, but she worried his reputation as, quote, the wickedest man in the world, a type, would scare off some newbies and taint Wiccan as a Satanist knockoff. She also wanted rituals that felt timeless and universal, not tethered to one man's philosophy. In her own words from her 1989 book, The Rebirth of Witchcraft, she saw Gardner's reliance on Crowley as a crutch and pushed for originality if the result was still modern. So keep in mind, she was still writing in 1989. That's how modern her rebranding and recreation of what we think of as Wiccanism today was.
Yeah.
So now we're going to talk a bit about the Druids, because this was another group from around the same time.
And this is so funny, because I grew up definitely with the impression that Wicca was kind of a, almost invented, sort of almost very commercial thing, tradition.
It is,
but
the hot
my
topic
mom,
religion.
I think, misled me to believe that Druidic practices were old and ancient, because there were in the Bay Area a bunch of like stone circles and fairy rings and other weird altars in the woods, because we'd go hiking a lot that we'd come across. And my mom would be like, oh, that was probably used for some kind of Druidic ritual. And I'm like, okay, this must be really old.
No, it was hippies.
That is, that would make sense. This was in California. This was like in the woods around in California. So this totally makes sense. Yeah.
Now it's being okay. So Stuckley, this is another guy from around the 1900s, reimagined. So basically, what we like the Druids, the people who think they're actually following Druidic practices, were largely seeded by a guy called Stuckley, but he imagined Druids, and this is what's really interesting here. When he recreated their ideas and ideology as noble proto-Christian philosophers rather than polytheistic ritual figures described by Romans. Here's his pitch. So he saw them as monotheists. He argued Druids worshipped a single supreme God, foreshadowing Christianity. He saw them as enlightened priests who taught morality and natural law, not pagan sacrificers. We know that human sacrifices were done, by the way, at the, what's it called, Stonehenge.
To be buried in that ditch at Stonehenge with the injuries he has suggests we have a sacrificial victim.
Yes, like actually back in the real day of there being a religion practice.
Yeah, the ancient Druids were brutal, evil people. We know that like they had a practice where when they make bridges, they would sacrifice children and bury them under the bridges so the bridges wouldn't fall down. Like that was a practice.
Yeah, it's funny when I've gotten tours of the areas around Stonehenge. I think you were actually there. We did this on our honeymoon. Yeah. They were like, it was probably just a mistake that there was a child here. Do you remember them saying that? They were like, there's probably an accident.
No. We have not a child, but an adult was sacrificed at Stonehenge, and we can see where they were hit on their head and everything and tied up. Yeah, so we know that these were done at Stonehenge. These are not good guys, and they certainly weren't monotheists by any understanding we have of the period. This individual who recreated modern Druidism linked it to biblical patriarchs like Abraham, suggesting they inherited primal universal faith from the Near East brought to Britain by Phoenician traders and lost tribes. So keep in mind, he's saying, this is like the lost tribes of Israel and Phoenician traders. The early Druids tried desperately to attempt to connect their religion to Christianity and monotheism because they saw that as like an Enlightenment ideal. Whereas the more modern ones try to say, no, it was the totally disconnected from Christianity, the ancient religion of this area, and polytheistic. So what we know of Druids, they left no written records, but we know from Roman writers, Caesar, Tacitus, Pliny, or later Celtic myths, and none of this stuff supports them. We know that they had multiple gods, for example, Lug, Ceranos, and they often were tied to bloody rites like the Wicker Man's burnings that Pliny mentions. Sorry, I misspoke here. It was actually Julius Caesar who wrote about the Wicker Man ceremonies, not Pliny. Pliny mentioned that they had human sacrifices, but Julius Caesar specifically goes into how these sacrifices were done. In his book, Commentary on the Gallic War, he writes that the Gauls would construct large figures made of osiers, a type of willow branch, fill them with living men, and then set them on fire as part of their sacrificial rituals. According to Caesar, these sacrifices were performed by the Druids, who believed that the gods required human life in exchange for propitiation. He notes that the Gauls preferred to use criminals for these sacrifices, but if such individuals were scarce, they would use innocent people. And I would also note that this is one of the only Druidic ceremonies that we have a description of. It's not like, we have a description of a bunch of nice ceremonies they did, and then there's this one crazy one. This is like one of the only Druidic ceremonies we have with any degree of historicity to it.
What is that? What is that? What is it? Oh, no, not the beast!
Stuckley, the guy who did this, had zero artifacts or texts, just speculation. As I said, to where he got this from, it was from the Enlightenment. The 1700s valued reason, order, and a single natural God. Stuckley projected this onto the past, he totally misread Stonehenge. He thought it was a temple made by Druids. We now know that no, it wasn't made by Druids. It was made around 2500 BCE, so the Neolithic period, well before the Druidic religion was ever came to exist. And it would have been old news by the age of the Druids, who were around c. 500 BCE to 43 BCE. So it was further from the Druids than we are from the Druids. That's how old Stonehenge is. Archaeologists now see it as a burial and ceremonial site, not a Druidic temple. And keep in mind, all the ideas he got about what the Druids believed, he got from Stonehenge, which didn't even have a connection to the Stonehenge in the Bible. That's where he got it from. A final interesting note here is another group that some people see as, they restarted the Druids, was Henry Hoole in 1781, who founded the Ancient Order of the Druids. However, this was a fraternity group, much more common to, say, Freemasonry. It didn't itself claim to come from any sort of ancient stuff. It didn't have the same sorts of rituals or anything like that. This is just a misreading of history. It was a secular society close to like the Society of Odd Fellows and stuff like that. And also it had ties to Christianity, again, trying to connect it. So I got to go too far here, but your thoughts, did this blow your brain given being raised a hippie?
This is wild. But I'm also starting to realize that the way we've seen super soft religions, what do they call the religions that people have built around Loki and Snape, for example?
They call them pop paganism.
Pop paganism. Yeah, I think pop paganism is the ultimate proof point that people don't need provenance in religion. That it's like the placebo effect, where like they've shown in studies that if you say this is a placebo, people have often found placebos to be quite effective. And then they give them the placebo. People are like, wow, I feel so much better from the placebo, which is an
I don't understand the point you're making here. I mean, I guess
my point here is that people don't need it to be real. They don't need it to be an active medication. They're okay with placebo religions. That is to say, religions without real history, without real provenance. And the existence of Snape wives and like Loki, like show that we are willing to induce suspended disbelief because it helps us feel a certain way.
I think these people believe it, and I think if you read the writings of Snape wives and stuff like that,
because they choose to believe it. That's what I'm saying. It's induced suspended disbelief.
Right, but these beliefs are convergent depending on the social context, but you often get the same like cluster of beliefs reappearing. And I do not think that like the Snape wives genuinely believe that Snape is a real person who influenced J.K. Rowling to write him. And I think
my point is that people are willingly deluding themselves into this.
I don't think they are. I don't think they are. I don't think that they go into this saying, oh, I'm going to choose to believe something that's not true. I think that you think they do. We'll let the audience.
There's not a conscious thought process. It's more like, wow, I like the aesthetics of this. Wouldn't this be kind of cool if it's true? And then you just go into it with a very, very open mind. And you don't look for the evidence to the contrary. You only lean in with full confirmation bias. And before you know it, you are convinced because you've only seen supporting evidence. You've only seen the lore. You've only had spiritual experiences in this framework. And that'll get you. It'll get you. It's enough.
I will say one thing that really, this Valerie woman, as I go through this, who sort of remade Wiccanism, I have to really respect her a lot for a few things. I think she was right in the way that she rebranded Wiccanism. I think it's a better branding for its growth and getting it to grow. I think that, imagine being like the right-hand man to this guy who then you find out made it all up. And you're still like, well, yeah, he made it all up, so I'm just going to make it cooler. But I guess that she probably heavily suspected or was like dealing with okay, this guy's crazy, or, just likes making things up, which is fine. That level of intellectual honesty and branding management, I think, is why when contrasted with the other new religions, this one has done particularly good at spreading. And I think casting it as, oh, these were what the ancient witches believed, or this concept of like Puritan witches and stuff like that, like, keep in mind, we have some understanding of like what the Puritan witches were like supposed to be doing in the woods. And it's nothing like modern Wiccan stuff. I mean, some modern Wiccans have tried to reinvent this stuff, like dancing naked in the woods and stuff like that, or trying to seduce people or whatever, right?
It also doesn't at all resemble the old superstitious things that you saw, for example, across Appalachia, where it was like, boil a puppy if you feel this way, or like cut off a kitten's tail. Remember those? I think they were described in Albion's Seed. That sounds like freaking witchcraft to me.
Yeah, no, I was like, what is actual? And we know about a lot of these rituals from, if you're like, oh, what rituals appeared and then disappeared? Well, like boiling puppies, which was done by my ancestors, the rural Appalachian people. That
is what is described in Macbeth. This is the, eye of Newt and toe of frog, that this is the thing.
Yeah, this is not.
So that if we're talking about witchcraft as seen in like stereotypical Shakespearean works, let's go to Appalachia. Let's see what they're up to, and not necessarily what 90s. Well, I guess she was writing in the 70s, but like, yeah, turn of the century.
Yeah, and if people are like, well, we don't know anything, so they could have been these various different faiths. It's like, yeah, we don't know much except for the sacrifice victims. We've got lots of those. So we do know they loved sacrificing humans. So if you're like, what do we know about these people?
Oh, no, not the beast!
Not the best. I think Christianity had a right to, as it was moving into these regions, be like, hey, we really need to stamp out these older religious traditions entirely. Now, some people have been like, well, couldn't there have been pockets of these ancient religions that were practiced in regions, right? Like with maypoles and stuff like that, and a few festivals. I would guess there probably could have been pockets, but the thing you have to remember is you get a church crackdown on one of these pockets, and if they don't hold a tradition for, let's say, even 50 or 60 years, it's going to be incredibly hard to recreate it from like local memory. Do you, for example, know the types of rituals that your grandparents got up to, or the types of, we should probably do an episode on that just for an example. We can look up the common rituals and myths of the 1900s. Like, for example, do you even know if your grandparents ever did a seance? It would be actually, if they...
No, I'm pretty sure none of my grandparents would have done a seance, because... one's in France during the war. One is in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl and war. Then the other two weren't really born yet until much later, like in the 50s, and they sort of grew up in the affluent, growing America in 1950s. So like totally not.
Okay, great grandparents, we'll say, because that would have been the period of seances. Even the ones in the war. No, a French person did at that period during the war.
Yeah, but then they were like in Romania and like fleeing Russia. So
okay. If your grandparents lived in the United States, let's say between 1900 and 1950, chances are, I'd say, because you
some
have
did a seance.
4 of them at least, I'd say over 50% that at least one of them participated in a seance. Yeah. And yet you don't know about this or not know about it because traditions just don't pass down that much. Folklore is pretty bad at passing down.
Yeah, that, and like I think that there's just really poor transmission even from grandparents. Like I had one grandmother who thought that she was reincarnated from a Native American woman. And like, that's all I heard. Cause it's kind of like, she's a little crazy. And like, I didn't hear like the belief system behind that. It was just like, yeah, she thinks this. And that's it. It's not like, well, what was that based on? Like, what was her religious framework here? I mean, she took all her kids.
Frameworks are forgotten. Like recently we got for our kids a book of Appalachian folktales. After I was reading one that's an old Appalachian like scary story that they've done a book of. I remember it from when I was a kid because I was like, oh my God, the guy's dogs die. Like I remember the guy's dogs dying as a kid. It's called Taily-Poo if you want to get it. It's a good story, very visceral for kids. They'll remember it. But I read it to the kids and I've forgotten at the end of the story, the guy dies too. Everyone in this story, the guy and his 3 dogs are murdered. And this was a children's tale. So slowly and one by one, like the dogs going into the woods and then going quiet, like very horror story-esque, not very, but it feels very authentic. You're like, yeah, this was definitely an old story. But then we got some called Jack's Tales and we started reading them. And I was reading the book and I was like, oh, holy Jack and the Beanstalk was not a standalone myth. Jack and the Beanstalk was part of a series of campfire stories about a boy named Jack who got up to crazy.
He was a busy boy. Yeah.
Completely lost in the cultural memory that was the case. And so I can see even within my own tradition how quickly these people who want to believe in ancestral traditions being passed down, I would just ask you, how many direct ancestral traditions do you have outside of your mainstream religion from your grandparents? You may have a few from one of them, but I would best for most people, it's almost none. And keep in mind, you have 4 grandparents. If even you can't remember the very things that your grandparents went through, how do you think this passes down for like dozens of times that number?
That's fair. Yeah.
Anyway, I love you to death, Simone. You are absolutely amazing, and thank you for being my wife.
Thank you for being my husband. I love you so much. My non-druidic husband.
My non-druidic, yes.
Yeah. This is the
Oh,
important
and
point.
by the way, if you want to go into early Christianity versus the religions it was replacing, we released an episode on Christmas Day, so like nobody watched it, called "Was Christianity Actually a More Moral Religion?" When I asked Grok what his favorite episode of our show was, it picked that episode. So if you guys want to check it out, Grok thinks it's the best.
So I'm excited for this. You haven't even talked to me about it, so I'm coming in blank. Don't know what to expect.
I mean, do you know anything about this or how the movement started or anything?
You know, I know I had my like 90s friends who had their, books from Barnes and Noble about Wicca. It was like, oh, Wicca, that thing you got a book at Barnes and Noble with a little gold foil cover that has little spells.
That's how you know it's magical.
That's how you know. If not gold, then silver foil.
Nothing could disappoint me more than if our kids end up becoming Wiccan. There's like
I don't
many
even think
religions.
it's Wicca though. I'd be more disappointed if they buy spells on Etsy or whatever it is, like from a TikTok influencer or something.
Although, I mean, I will tell my sons the truth. You want to find easy girls? Look for Wiccans.
Oh my god,
that's an easy group.
Yeah, but that's also they're like the kind of people that I would expect to cut holes in condoms and stuff. This is a no-no.
It's true. Yeah.
So just don't.
Okay. I'll get started here.
Octavian, Titan's stealing your backpack. Octavian, Titan stole your backpack. Are you gonna go get it?